Welcome everybody to our AMPlify session on applying for an ARC DECRA. I'm Melissa Forbes and I'm the ECR Development Chair for AMPS, and very pleased to welcome our panel today. But before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on where I'm located, which is in Toowoomba. So it's the Gayabal and Jarowair people of the Toowoomba region. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. So we are very lucky today to be joined by 3 ARC DECRA Fellows, and we'll talk a little bit about what the DECRA program is all about. But the format of today is really for us to use these guys as a brains trust. If you're interested in applying for an ARC DECRA, this is an amazing opportunity to really, grill them about what the experience was like and what it's now like to actually be working as an ARC DECRA Fellow. So please make the most of this opportunity. There's really not a lot of information out there, I don't think, about how to go about this. It's all about tapping into networks and people who have done it before. So really make the most of the opportunity would be my advice. So briefly, we have Steffen Herff, we have Helen English, and we have Anna Fiveash. And I think that rather than me talking about them, they can talk about themselves much more eloquently. So I might ask Steffen first, if you can just introduce yourself, Steffen, and give us a brief overview of your project, and then we'll move to Helen and Anna in the same way. So
Sure.
Steffen?
Well, thanks a lot for having me. As mentioned, my name is Steffen Herff. I've did my PhD here at the Marx Institute in 2017. Afterwards, I went on a grant to Germany for a little bit less than a year. From there, I went to Singapore, worked there with government and healthcare sector and research. From there, I went to Switzerland, and from there, I worked a couple of various grant projects. And then I came back for the DECRA just at the end of last year. And my DECRA project is sort of broadly in the domain of music, but sort of more on the experimental psychology side. And specifically what we're interested in is music and mental imagery. So this is the idea on how we can use music to induce mental imagery and how we can use music to shape vividness, sentiment, and content of this mental imagery, to learn a bit more about cognition, sort of subconscious processing, and how this may be useful for healthcare processes and well-being in general.
Great. And so you're, say, 6 months into your progress, Steffen? Your project, Steffen?
Yeah, a bit more than that. It's been 8, I think, but yeah,
Yep.
That's about where we are.
Yeah, okay, great. Helen, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your project?
Yes, of course, I'd love to. So myself first, yes. So I work at the University of Newcastle. Before that, I worked at the University of Tasmania. I'm a very late starter in academia. I was a musician for a long time in the UK and Australia. And I got my first full ongoing position at the University of Newcastle and got my PhD in 2016. And so I'm representing the older end of academia.
High five.
And so I've got lots of experience. Yeah, so I'm slightly different to some DECRAs in that I already had an ongoing position at the university. In fact, I was a senior lecturer. Since then, I got promoted to associate professor. And yeah, I just had to go at doing a DECRA because it seemed the thing to do. So what I'm interested in, so I moved from a PhD, which was more historically focused in using sociology to inquire into the affordances of music for migrants, particularly coal miners. And I moved from that into how does music help people in the community today, because I'm in a coal mining community anyway, so there are still brass bands and different ensembles that have remnants from brass band days, so, and choirs. And from that, I moved to my topic, mainly through my collaboration with Jane Davidson. I got sort of moved towards creative aging. So my topic's actually called Creative Aging Through Transformative Engagement with Music. And the transformative and the engagement are the key things in that sentence. So thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this session.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Really appreciate that overview. And Anna?
Hi, yes. So I am really interested in music and language broadly, and my kind of path has gone from a psychology degree into an honours year where I kind of was like, oh, I love music and I've always made music. And now I was trying to find a supervisor who would also be interested in music like I was, and I couldn't really find one. So I ended up actually talking with Kirsten Palmer, who was really into language. And she was like, well, if we can combine music and language, would this be something interesting? And I started reading about it. I was like, oh, this is great. So kind of went into honours and then kind of followed that with a master's in music psychology. And then did the PhD with Bill Thompson at Macquarie in Sydney. And then I got a 2-year postdoc in Lyon in France, looking at music rhythm and how it can support and help language processing. And that 2-year contract kind of kept getting extended. So I ended up being there for about 5.5 years, working also with Vanderbilt University through Raina Gordon, a big collaboration with Raina Gordon as well. So my DECRA is all about kind of combining my PhD work, which was looking at syntax in music and language specifically, with my postdoc work, which was looking into rhythm. And then my DECRA was about how the brain predicts music and language, looking at both content and timing and the interactions between those. So it's called Music and Speech as a Window into the Predictive Brain. So I kind of really push that idea that you can better understand how the brain is predicting by using music and speech, which are really great and interesting and different in different ways. So that was kind of my angle there.
Yeah, amazing, wonderful, thank you. So in terms of the scheme itself, my understanding is that it's Discovery Early Career Research Award. That's what DECRA stands for. And it's part of the Discovery suite of schemes that the ARC offers. And broadly speaking, Discovery projects are blue sky projects. So, you know, they're quite open in terms of the research that they will fund. But for the early career scheme itself, you have to be no more than 5 years out from your PhD. So there's a big question always around the timing of this and when's the best time to apply for a DECRA. And I should note that that 5 years does take into account career interruptions and things. So it's not, you know, a strict kind of calendar 5 years. If you've had times where you've been out of employment or out of research completely, or for family reasons or whatever, that is taken into account when they're calculating that time frame. So yeah, it's really important, I think, to be kind of strategic about when you actually apply. And I know that people can apply, some people might apply once or twice, you know, depending on whether they get anywhere or not the first time around. So, you know, if you're thinking that you're going to try a couple of times, then it's really important to kind of plan this out, I guess, well in advance. So if we can talk about that for a minute, does anyone want to jump in and have their 2 cents about thoughts on strategies around timing and, you know, where does your track record need to be at to even consider applying for something like this, that kind of thing?
I don't mind having a go because I did try twice. I don't know about Steffen and Anna. Well, probably the most useful thing that someone said to me was that my track record was not good enough. And it's just really great when someone doesn't try and say, make it sound okay, nice when it's not. and you realize, oh, because nobody had said that to me before. So before I applied for DECRA, I worked really hard on my track record, which is hard because, you know, publications can take so long, especially in my field where it might be a book or book chapters as well as articles. But yeah, I managed to get enough. And then you hear lots of stories about people's amazing track records, you know, from people who've been in the carriage and the experts and so on, and, you know, report back. But you mustn't be put off by that as long as you've got sufficient. So I would say, so that's the first part, build up your track record before you even think about applying, because otherwise it will be a wasted effort.
And then, sorry, just to jump in there, Helen, really I think track record needs to be very much started while you're doing your PhD, ideally, right? You know, in terms of publications.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I was publishing while I was doing a PhD. That's
true. Yeah.
I had to, yeah, we don't need to know all the details. I'm just trying to think what's important to say. I think the track record isn't just about publications, though. I was looking over the one that I sent in for the first time, and I emphasize collaborations a lot because I think that does go down really well. They're looking for people who are going to be building and networking. And in fact, you know, it became, once you have one, you find out that actually they don't really mind if you go off the plan that you put in, as long as you're networking and growing and you know, you're making something happen as it were, out of nothing. So yeah, so I think most people end up sort of applying in their last chance year or the year before that, because they've got to get the track record ready and find the institution, which I already had. So yeah, I guess that would be the point. So you can only do it twice. So the second time I was in that odd year, I've just realized I wasn't in your year, Steffen. I was the year before. I was in that odd year where you could try that year or have an extra year.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that was because of COVID. Yeah, I think. Yes. Yep. I hope that's given something. Sorry, I just rabbited on a bit.
No, that's great, Helen. So if we stick with timing, Anna, Steffen, did you want to chime in with anything there? We'll get to where next. Yeah.
I mean, Steffen just put a nice graph. Did you want to explain that?
Sure. So, I mean, it's always good to sort of, I think it's when going for things like a DECRA, it's always a good idea to sort of mix your sources of information. And I think it's a good idea to sort of, these personal reports as ours are, I think, very useful. At least I found them useful when I went basically through the same cycle. But I think it's also very useful to just look at the raw numbers. And basically the raw numbers just support exactly everything that Helen just said. And this is that you need to build up a track record, and that takes time. And usually what happens is that your track record gets assessed based to the opportunities that you've had. And that means that your personal peak might be earlier or later, because maybe your PhD was going very strong. Maybe you managed to extend your PhD period, so by the time you get out of it, you're quite competitive. So it might be a strategic decision to then go for it. So the question is how competitive are you in relation to your peers at that particular career stage? But in general, as you can see in the graphs, this comes from the ARC website itself. There's definitely clear trajectory peaking around sort of 3 to 4 years. As very unfortunate with all of these graphs, there's always a very strong gender discrepancy. And NHMRC and ARC say that they're working hard on this, and there's hope it's getting better, but there's still definitely a big problem there. But generally, what you can learn from this is that you've got 2 shots. The second one should be 3 to 4 years, and the first one, if you have a go at it, maybe a little bit earlier, but you want to be applying at a point where you personally are quite competitive. And this might be early, this might be late, but usually what happens is that if you haven't scored a big grant up to 3 to 4 years after, which is why you're applying for the DECRA, is that probably afterwards sort of your competitiveness slowly tempers off a little bit. And this is why usually sort of 3 to 4 is probably a pretty solid choice.
But it can depend on your postdoc as well. So if you have like a solid postdoc that's going to cover you, I would kind of keep producing as much as you can and even go in on that 5th year, because if you come in then with a really strong track record that's better than the 4th year, I think that can still be competitive. You say, okay, look, I have this great postdoc. I stayed in this because it was stable and I did this, and now I'm applying for the DECRA, and then you can still look like a really good candidate. But I definitely think it's a good idea to have the 2 shots. So don't apply on your 5th year, because then it's tricky. I also had people telling me if I was competitive or not. So I think people who know these grants have an idea about your track record. And I agree with what you two have said about it's kind of the bigger picture as well. So not just how many publications do you have, but your collaborations, your networks, your background, where you've come to, but also the project. So it's like 40% you and you as a researcher and your potential to be a great researcher, and then 40% the project itself. So that's a pretty heavy personal thing. And I think it's bigger than later ones as well.
Yeah. And when it comes to assessing how competitive you are, it's very important not only to talk to someone who knows the scheme very well, but also to talk to someone who knows the scheme in relation to your particular field very well, because there can be vast differences, citations in music compared to, say, pure neuroscience or medical work. It's a very different beast. So it's quite easy to get very frustrated if you look at maybe pure health research that has 10 times the citations, and you might feel sort of insecure that you are not quite there yet. But maybe in relation to your field, you're actually quite competitive, because fields just behave differently, and the examiners, they know this, and they take this very strongly into account. So that, don't feel put off only because you are sort of in music, and music might cite less than other fields.
But you can also push that in your application, say, for music science, this is the top journal, or because this is a psychology journal, so it's a broader audience, so it's more impressive. And my citations of this is equivalent to, like, you do have to tell them, because the person might not necessarily know that. Ideally they will. But yeah, I agree. That's good.
Yeah, I think also in terms of like doing a self-assessment of your competitiveness to even apply, it's a good idea to go onto the ARC website, because you can search all the funded projects, you can search by scheme, you can search by FOR code. So you can kind of go through and look historically at the people who've been awarded a DECRA or any of the schemes. And then you can, look up their track record, whatever's available online, and kind of do some benchmarking as well. I'm specifically saying that for people who may be not currently in an institution where they can access colleagues to discuss, or have people look at their particular situation. So I think there's a lot that you can do in terms of online information to kind of assess where you are relative to other people at a similar career stage in your exact field, just by what's available on like the ARC website. So yeah, okay. Any other thoughts on timing, or any questions from anyone on timing? No? Feel free to put stuff in the chat if you want to ask a question. So Anna, when we were kind of chatting on the email about what we'd talk about, you raised the issue of where to apply. And I'm like Helen, I've got a job in a university, and so I don't think about these things. And of course, if I applied, I would apply through my institution where I work. But for other people who don't have a permanent position, this is a big issue, and you've got to kind of figure out where's going to be the best place for you to align yourself to in terms of what you're interested in, and who can, support you in that. So did you want to talk about that issue of choosing an institution? Because these fellowships and these grants have to be administered by an Australian university. So
yeah, and it's actually really, really important. And I don't think I realized how important it was at the beginning. So basically, I'm Australian and I was in France, and I wanted to come back to Australia. And the best place for me in Australia to do research on music and speech is at the Marx Institute at Western Sydney University. So little did I know that that's actually really, I think, set me up for success in that as well. So I was lucky that it aligned with my research interests completely. And I think that's pretty important, because you have to prove why you're applying to this institute, why they're going to have the great facilities for you. And you get like a strong support letter from the university. And some universities are more competitive than others in these grants. So at the Marx Institute, we actually have a grants person who really helps you with, they kind of know all these things, right? All the things that you don't know. So for that, you really have to kind of think pretty early about where you're planning to apply, and to have a mentor or a person within the institution who would be interested in collaborating on that project. So for me, it was Peter Keller. I did know him vaguely. I'd met him a few times through AMPs, through different conferences. And he was really a great person at the Marx Institute for me to work with. So I got in touch with him. He got in touch with the grants people. We figured out the really long timeline. It's massive. You have to put an expression of interest first for the university. I assume that's similar for other universities. Yep. And then because it's so much effort for the university to support you, they actually then only select people who they think are going to be competitive. So really, even before you think of your project in a way, or even before you nail out the details, if you can think of someone who would be interested in working with you on your project, who would come from a university that is interested in getting these kinds of grants, and ideally who has a support network for helping you with that. I think those are all good things to think about.
So in terms of the time frame, you'd really be wanting to contact, say if we were thinking I'm going to apply for a DECRA next year, you'd be wanting to have those conversations this year about that, wouldn't you? Because of the EOI process and the lead times on everything at the latest. At the latest,
I think you probably would have talked about it already, to be honest.
From
memory, it was like March even that the expressions of interest came out. Actually, for Western Sydney now, I think it's June that they're available, like you have to put them in. And then I think it's, I don't know the timeline exactly, but it's about a year, I would say. It's like a long-term planning thing. And I mean, I applied for this maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, and I've only started, in the last 6 months. So it's a really difficult thing actually to get the timing right. But
Steffen?
Maybe a small thing adding to this. I sign everything that Anna just said, spot on. Just to make it a little bit more concrete, when we say, a good institute that can support you, we're talking cash on the table here. So when that's the unfortunate reality, when your DECRA is being assessed, they're going to see you, they're going to see the project, but they're going to look at the research environment, and they only want to invest into projects which are going to be successful, that are going to be impressive. And as a result, they're looking to how much is the institute willing to support you. And as a result of this, you have the institutes sort of bidding against each other, saying things like, okay, well, if that DECRA is successful, they're going to get a complimentary PhD student, or, they're going to get, this extra travel fund, or we're going to, buy the EG system for them or whatnot. And this is something that that takes a big role in the assessor, and exactly as Anna said, is one of the reasons why the university just doesn't, throw as many DECRAs out there as they want. Because on the one hand, they want to have high success rate for the DECRAs, because that's an assessment criteria for the university and leadership itself. So that has sort of the side effect that when you look on the ARC website at what the DECRA success rate is massively inflated, because there's just a huge amount of applications been sort of sorted out already on the university or institute level. So only those that all the institutes and universities deem competitive sort of go into that number in there. But it's because the universities and institutes are actually sort of betting on the DECRAs and putting resources into it. And they just can't do that with sort of an infinite number of things. So when you have these conversations, it's important to talk transparently and openly with them and try to suss out, okay, what, hands down, what can they actually contribute to the application in terms of support, in terms of funding, in terms of, administrative support, direct costs, indirect costs. And sometimes what the institutes put on the table is pretty generous and quite large. And then those applications will have definitely a sort of cherry on top of it. And if you don't have this, then that doesn't mean you can't get a DECRA. It just means that you're, starting sort of a little bit disadvantaged compared to others.
And something I didn't quite appreciate a while back before I started looking into all of this is, the difference between, say, a DECRA fellowship and just a regular grant is that the fellowship actually pays your salary. So it's effectively a job, for people like Steffen and Anna. And so, it's attractive, I guess, for institutes in that sense, because your salary is subsidized by that fellowship for the period of time that you have it. So that's an interesting and an important distinction. I think that they're quite prestigious in that way too, because they're actually paying for you to do the work. Whereas with a lot of other grants, you'll get money for an RA, or you might get money for a PhD student, but there's no actual cash on the table for you to do the work. It's supported by the institution if you are lucky enough to have a job at an institution. Yeah.
And I think that's why it has to be a good fit, because they've got to think, will I want to employ this person when they finish the DECRA?
Yeah.
That's something that when you assess them, you're supposed to look at too, right? How well does that person fit with the institution? What will happen when it finishes? Will they be employed?
And And that's not guaranteed anymore.
It's not guaranteed.
That used to be, if you get a DECRA, you get a job. And now it's like, if you get a DECRA, good job. Good luck with the rest of your life.
And that's just so crazy, isn't it? Considering how competitive they are to get and how,
And the next grant that actually pays your salary is the Future Fellow, which is, you can't apply for it until 10 years after.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a gap there, isn't there?
Big gap. So if you don't have a continuing position and you get another grant, it's tricky. You have to secure some. I mean, you get a better bargaining place, but it's still tricky.
I applied for a DECRA and didn't get it, and one of my colleagues was like, "Oh, why are you applying for a DECRA? You've already won the lotto because you've actually got a job," and I hadn't really thought of it like that way. Like, if you have a continuing position, you have really, what everybody at the end of the day wants to get, which is the job, the ongoing job. I still would have loved to get a DECRA, but that in a way for me was like, well, look, there are lots of people out there who don't actually have jobs, and this is a way for them to secure employment for the period, and it's absolutely vital for those people, these types of schemes. And it's just kind of sad that more people, aren't able to access funding through these, like Steffen, you're saying that the success rates are inflated. I mean, the success rates are pretty low already.
And
terribly low.
And that's terrible.
That's exactly right. And it was interesting you were talking about, getting in touch with an institute or finding that person that you want to work with, and not necessarily having to have a fully conceived project at that point. I think that's an important thing for people to know. So if we turn our discussion now to actually conceiving the project, can you talk a little bit about how it's important to kind of demonstrate that the project is a natural extension from what you've been doing, and it might take your work in a new and innovative and exciting direction, that kind of thing. It can't just be something that you plucked out of the ether that is completely disconnected to who you are as a researcher. So can we just talk about that for a little bit? Annie, you're kind of nodding. Did you want to say something there?
I totally agree. I think you have to prove that you can do what you're saying you're going to do, and it's got to be something that you can do, but also it's new and different and fun and exciting and topical. I think that was one of the other things we were talking about. You have to prove that there's a need for it. You have to prove that you're the most perfect person in the whole world to do this exact project. So you kind of have to, it's a weird way of writing, actually. And it's one thing to say, oh, I am an expert in this thing and I'm going to combine it with this, and then that's going to create this whole new thing, which is going to be amazing. So, I mean, for me, I mentioned already that I kind of combined two of my really areas of interest and areas in which I have experience, and created kind of the logical next step. So for me, that was relatively easy, I suppose, I could see that as the next step for me. So maybe just have a think about what your next step would be, also what you're interested in doing. I think that really shows. If you're interested in something, it's a lot easier to write about it. But yeah, thinking about like an extension of what you've already done. And if it is a whole new thing or a little bit of a new thing, maybe some pilot data or something like this, which could probably help boost your case, that you have an idea of how it works. That could be.
Helen, I'm interested in, sorry, I'll get to you, Steffen. I was just while I'm on this topic, Helen, you kind of talked about, you did take your research in a different direction. How did you maneuver that? And did your project change substantially from the first time you applied to the second time, in terms of the ideas?
Oh, right. Okay, so it was a big challenge to make sense of what I'd done already and where I was moving to. That was challenging, so I had to find a way to sort of encapsulate coal miners using music to gain respect as well as enjoyment, and create communities with people wanting to age well through music. So I put a lot of effort into trying to create a narrative about that. And sorry, what was the next thing that you wanted me to talk about?
Whether the project changed from the first time to the second time?
No.
Right.
So what happened was not much. Trying to think. I think I didn't just put in the same, obviously. I interrogated every little aspect of it and to see if there's anything that wasn't clear, like the word transformative. I interrogated that. I used all of my feedback from the first one to make sure I absolutely covered everything they said, you know, like when they challenged the use of the word inclusion, so I went into that and so on. But I guess I'd done a lot of outreach, so that was how I justified it, because I've done a lot of outreach mainly with children from low socioeconomic backgrounds, but also some with adults with disabilities. So I used that as the thing that I was familiar with before even I became an academic, that I had this kind of knowledge and capital of knowing how to work with people in outreach situations and the immediate benefits of using music and other creative and performing arts with people that you see. So that I think I leveraged a lot on that. And as I said, I also leveraged a lot on my collaborations with people who were in creative aging.
Yeah, great.
Does that answer it?
Yeah, thank you. And
Okay,
Steffen?
thanks.
Sorry, I cut you off before.
I think the thing to consider with any fellowships is that what you're trying to achieve is that you want to demonstrate that this is an amazing project. And as I said, you are perfectly positioned to do this, in fact, uniquely, and you're doing it at exactly the right place. Now, the reality is that when you go for a DECRA, you're early in your career, which means there are many, many topics out there where other people are perfectly well equipped for it as well. And as a result of this, I've in the past applied for many grants and have accumulated an impressive amount of rejections, and noticed that whenever I'm trying to chase things which I think are useful or impactful, I dramatically failed. And whenever I go for something which I'm extremely excited about and I can sort of spin it to sound useful, it somehow works always better. That doesn't mean that it always works, but it certainly works better. So the reason why I'm saying this is that since you want to sort of prove these three pillars, you know, amazing project, you're perfectly situated to go for it at the ideal institute, but you are sort of early in your career. What I found useful is that you sort of rotate the model a little bit and just start by yourself. And the reality is that every PhD journey is dramatically different. There's not two that are even remotely similar. It's one of those jobs where everyone is sort of, they're very unique individual. And it might be worth just meditating about what are your unique skills, what are your unique interests, and the unique things that sort of separate you. There's a lot of, say, maybe you're a person, you know, that you may be an excellent musician. There are many excellent musicians, but you happen to be an excellent musician that also has a really big interest in botany. Who knows? And then suddenly, you know, the subset of uniqueness becomes quite small and you're really standing out. So really think about sort of what are your skill sets, what are your hobbies, your interests, your tangible research outputs that, you know, you can prove that you have these skills or prove that you have these interests, that really sort of uniquely identify you. And then think about a project that fits with that. That doesn't mean you have to continue what you've been doing. It's just think about something that sort of combines, and I think Anna's a perfect example, did this very successfully, combine sort of the different inputs that you've had and your unique position. And then you start with you're uniquely positioned for it, which means you've got one of the pillars already fixed. That makes your life much, much easier. Because usually that pillar of I'm perfectly positioned for this application is usually the hardest in your early career stage if you start with a project, because often you might come up with a great project, but you know, if it's a purely healthcare project, there might be other people who are equally, if not better, qualified for it. But if you start with yourself, then you sort of fix that in so far as you're obviously most qualified for this because you literally put yourself as a starting point. And then you try to find a project that fits with you. And once you got these two, you can find an institute that matches that. And by that point, you can approach the institute with, you know, if you don't have one already, you can approach them with a pretty unique sort of sales pitch, which they might be receptive to.
And my understanding is, as part of that sales pitch, it's really important also to demonstrate that the project needs to be done now. It's a timely project. It connects into the zeitgeist, if you like. And, you know, on the first page of a project description, after the first paragraph or so, the assessors should be thinking, yes, this needs to be done now. Do you think that's an important part of pitching the project itself and, you know, the timeliness of it? Because we've talked a lot about the person and we've talked a lot about, you know, the location, but, you know, connecting the project to current issues and priorities.
Definitely. And also, if you can link, we haven't talked about that. I don't know if we will, but the benefits section, you have to, there's a big section in there to prove why this project is going to be beneficial for the Australian government. And that can be hard because the government has criteria, outlines, things that they care about, and you have to find the things that you could match with what you care about. And sometimes it's a bit of a stretch, right? So, I mean, for me, prediction is a big hot topic, which is lucky. I think it's been a big hot topic for a while, and I think you can always tell people why this is important right now, even if you can link it in with some of the government priorities at some point, great. But I think most projects, if they're interesting, they can be interesting over time. I don't know if that's true for everything, but
yeah. Let's actually look at the application itself. So it's a bit of a beast of a thing. It's quite enormous. And I think, you know, if my tip to people would be try to become registered as an assessor now. You know, if you've got some runs on the board and you've got some good publications, you'll probably be accepted as an assessor. I did that a few years ago, and actually reading people's applications as an assessor is a really great way to learn about the format of ARC applications and all of the different sections. And, you know, reading people's applications really helps you to understand what works and what doesn't. I think it's very hard to come into this world completely cold and not really being aware of the conventions around these applications. So with that being said, the way that these applications are kind of the structure of them is that there's a section at the top which is administrative type information, where you have to write a project summary, you have to have a national interest test statement. A lot of blood, sweat and tears go into these things, and they're literally like a few hundred words. And there's stuff, you know, just kind of there's some, you know, tick boxes and yes and no type questions, but even the project summary and the NIT, don't underestimate how long it's going to take you to craft those things. And they seem like the easy bits at first, but they're actually not. So there's all of that administrative information, and then you get to the project description, which is 10 pages. And they're very strict on font size, and, you know, it can't be more than 10 pages, and your margins and all of that. So you have to be kind of aware of that, those types of requirements. And then there are certain sections within that project description that you need to kind of hit. So it's quite formulaic, I guess. And it's also, as Anna said, it's a weird way of writing. It's a lot more, to me, a lot more corporate in a way, particularly the first page or so, where you're really making that pitch and trying to grab the attention of the assessors to say, this is great, this is really, you know, important work, I'm the right person for the job, etc., etc. And it can feel quite weird to be having to kind of talk something up that hasn't even happened yet, but saying how amazing it's all going to be, you know, in that kind of first page of the project description. So do you want to talk about, maybe let's talk about the project description, because it is it's a substantial piece of work for the application, and it's very time consuming to put it together. Any tips on how to get started? I think having examples is always really useful. Seeing someone else's worked example, even if it wasn't successful, you know, I still think that's a useful thing to do. What do you guys think in terms of getting started on that? Obviously, looking at the guidelines and making sure that you have that Bible next to you at all times, and you're checking that you are using the current version of the headings and things that they want. You're looking at the criteria all the time and making sure that you're hitting those criteria in what you're writing. Yeah, any thoughts on that project description section?
Actually, no. Oh, sorry, Anna.
No, you go first. That's good.
I'll just quickly say that I've now remembered that they changed. You're right. They changed the order the first time I did it. and then they put it back to how it was before.
Yeah, so you have to be really careful with that. Like if you are using, if you're having a look at other people's previous examples from previous years, don't copy the headings from them. You always have to look at the current guidelines because they make subtle changes all the time. So that's an important thing to be aware of. Steffen, did you have something you wanted to add there?
I think going back, the question was about the starting point for the project. One of the best advice I've ever received from someone was smacking my first draft immediately into my face and say, where's the pilot data? It's a more and more bigger trend that if your study is empirical, that pilot data carries you a great bit. And if you submit a grant without pilot data and are being assessed at other people that have pilot data, then the funding body is just going to go in and say, well, we could take this risk, or we go with a person that's sort of the preliminary assumption. So of course, there is a balance. So don't go pilot data that proves your projects and makes it redundant. But the reality is that most projects have sort of critical assumptions. And if they don't work, then it's a risky project. And proving that critical assumption with a pilot study can carry you a long way because it demonstrates so many things simultaneously. It shows that, yes, you're not a risk factor. Yes, you have those skills that you are promising that are needed for this project. And you take it serious, it's professional, you've got it all there. So if you are a project where pilot data is an option, and it not always is, depending on the project, it might just not just be irrelevant. But if it's something where pilot data can be obtained and used, I would never submit a grant without pilot data for my type of research.
Yeah, it's a great point. Thank you. Anna, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe I think there's a lot of steps to this, right? Like you're not going to write your beautiful, perfect project description that's like, this is amazing, let's go. I think really there's a big, long, months-long development stage. So thinking about, okay, this is the general area. Then you discuss that with someone and then they go, oh, what about this? And what about that? And that takes a while. Then you start writing things around it. And one thing I didn't realize was that I didn't realize how specific you had to be in the experimental design. So I thought I could be a bit vague, I could have, this is what I'm interested in and I'll do something like this, but I really had to outline each individual experiment, how it fitted into my, I created 2 streams of research to make it look more kind of sexy. And then you have stream 2 isn't dependent on stream 1. That's pretty important. I think especially also without pilot data, I didn't have any pilot data, but I had proof that I'd done similar things before. So I think if it's a totally new thing, for sure, pilot data. I don't think it's necessary if you can also prove that you could do it. I think that's the risk element you were talking about. I agree with that. But I think the development of those experiments really is time consuming because I ended up with 10 experiments. They're all a little bit different. Some of them developed on each other, but my experimental design was totally different like 4 months before I submitted the application. And then when I started giving it to people I trusted, people who had good experimental design skills, they're like, why did you do that? What about this? What about that? And then I was like, and then I missed a whole bunch of literature on expectation because it used to be called expectation, not prediction, right? So it's actually really important to do it early, to talk to people you trust. And I got lots of feedback from my mentor here, my mentor overseas, and also people within the institute who read your drafts. And I even got input from the director who told me, you're writing like a woman, which I was a little bit offended about to begin with, but then I kind of understood what they meant, more like you're kind of pulling back a bit on the awesomeness, which I'm not sure if that's it. I mean, I think women do it, but I think men do it too. And I think it's a difficult way of writing because you have to go out and say how incredible all of this is. But that's really the finessing part at the end. I don't think, maybe don't worry about that yet. But if you can get a solid experimental design, I agree, the first page is like, bam, like this is what it is, this is why it's important, and write it for like a layperson, like a scientifically knowledgeable layperson. But why is it interesting to the government? Like, why do people care? Why do Australians care? What's the point of this? Like, if you can't answer those questions, then that's when it becomes tricky, I would say.
Almost a litmus test, I think, for when you're reading it yourself. If you're not cringing, going, "Oh God, I can't believe I'm writing this," then you haven't gone hard enough. You know, like you've got to go really, really hard, and that's against most people's nature to do that. So
become the person you hate.
Yeah, at least on paper.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about the project description, do you want to talk about the benefit section? So one of the sections in that 10-page document is benefits. So we touched on that a little bit before. And I think from memory, there's kind of criteria around benefit to the discipline or to culture or society. You're tying it into government priorities, and if there's specific policy around that, that's even better, even easier to kind of make that alignment. Any other benefit stuff that we want to mention? I did want to pick up on the point that Amanda put into the chat around that there are specific things that at the ARC won't fund. So this is really important for people who are working in the wellbeing space, for example. So my project was a wellbeing type project, and I had an external reviewer say, alarm bells, this sounds like a health project to me, and you will get knocked out. You won't be eligible because the ARC won't fund health related projects. And so this is something that you really want to be aware of if you're working in that space, because you need to be able to cast the project in terms where it is going to be beneficial to people, but not from a strictly health perspective. Has anyone else kind of run across those types of issues when thinking about how to cast the project, but making sure that it's still going to have the benefit that you want it to have?
So before I submitted the DECRA, I submitted a very similar grant to a Swiss fellowship. And there the split is different, and health and basically ARC fought on the same one. And it was a relatively health-focused project. So I then translated that into the DECRA and worked a lot on that one, and you know, with my support network here, and then submitted it. And then exactly this happened, where basically every advisor at the institute was going like, "What are you doing? This is a health project," which I should have known, but I didn't. And that's exactly why you need people who will tell you the truth, because it's very useful. And that just got me thinking, because then I sort of had to cut out 50% of the entire project out of it. And I was thinking, okay, well, that part is gone, which first was a shock, but then was also relieving, because suddenly you have this sort of creativity and not the need to fill it with health application if you don't want to, and then sort of take an entirely different angle on it, which in my case sort of was then filled with music generation, which was not in the project initially. And it worked out quite all right in the end. But that part is very important. You've got one thing to say is, though, you've got a little section where you can clarify. So if your project is health related, sort of tangent to it, you can say, oh, you know, this improves well-being and it makes people in general be better, but we're not doing clinical trials. We're not doing health indicators and these sort of things. So if you can use that section. So you can actually be relatively close to health, as long as you justify in that section very clearly why this is not considered a health or clinical health project.
Yeah, and use the wording from the ARC policies around that, so that you're, you know, very clearly demonstrating that you're aware of what the issues are and where the boundaries lie. Look, I'm just aware that we're running out of time, and we've got so many other things that we could be talking about. This is the last chance, guys, to ask specific questions from you if you want to tap into this wealth of knowledge that we have on the call. But in the absence of that, one of the really important components of this application is the ROPE. Now, this statement, tell me what it stands for. ROPE. Relative to opportunity, performance, something.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I know. It's funny, isn't it?
Research output or something?
performance something, I don't know. But anyway, this is like a five-page statement about your experience as a researcher. And again, it follows a formula. So there are kind of specific headings that you have to hit in that statement. But this is the place where you really, you know, you do get a high cringe factor when you're writing it, because you really have to go to town. So this is also where they're going to be assessing the investigator capability, which is, I think Anna said, was around the 40% mark. So it's heavily weighted. Any tips on the rope statement?
I do like a big brainstorm of everything you've ever done. Like, ideally your CV is a bit updated, but just trying to like brain dump every single award thing, like anything that could be amazing. Because I kind of did that, and I had a lot of stuff that in the end, like, oh, that doesn't support my trajectory. Like, so I kind of did a big brainstorm of everything. Any collaborators, especially international collaborators, if you can say, oh, I'll have input from Professor whatever in this great country. I think all of that looks great if you can show that you've got this great network. If you don't, you could start developing it. I would kind of suggest that through people if you can. But yeah, I mean, in the end, ideally, you kind of have to, give this idea kind of, okay, what we were saying before, this publication, I got this many citations, and this is great in the music science field because of this. But yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think I kind of just did a big brainstorm and then tried to structure it with a bit of a timeline as well.
Yeah. Helen, did you have anything? Any pearls of wisdom on the rope?
Yeah, so you do get to say that in the research context, what's normal in your discipline. So it's really important to set that out. Yeah, I think one of the things I was going to say just generally about the whole thing is to try and break up solid text as much as possible with dot points. I mean, like in my benefits section, and I think it's worth really taking some time on benefits, because try and think of every benefit you can. And I sort of had the usual paragraphs, a couple of paragraphs on the new knowledge and something else. And then I had actually a little dot point list of who does it benefit. It just makes it much easier for the reader. So if you think about the reader, so the same in the rope, there probably are headings. I don't remember what they are now. Maybe collaboration was one of them. But if you can break up some of it into like, these are the key areas I've been driving. And then these are my collaborations, and break it into paragraph for each one, short paragraph, anything like that. Use bold font if you want. Do some lists of awards. All of those things just really help people navigate your document, because I know now that I review them that it's pretty tiring reading.
Yeah, and I think if you're from a more of a humanities background, you tend to write in paragraphs. But then I've noticed, I've seen, STEM applications that the university has given to us as examples, and their ropes are bullet points, lists of achievements kind of thing with no real explanation. And these are from successful applications. So it is a bit of a discipline thing, but I think regardless, you always want to be thinking of your reader, who's the assessor, and making their life as easy as possible, and not drain them with blocks and walls of text.
Yeah. I think an important part of the rope section is that you have to strike a balance. This is not a place to be humble, but it's also not a place to, be very extravagant and talk about it. So you're not going to say, I'm so spectacular and awesome, and you just throw everything in it. I think examiners tend to be very wary of bullshitting in these type of sections. So you really want to be just very factual. So you think about it this way: you've set out a cool project. So you start on the first project page, the reader reads the project and go like, this is a spectacular project. If they don't think this, you're out anyway. But let's assume that they think this because your project is great. And sort of the rest of the project description's purpose is to not let them lose that feeling. And the way you make them not let it lose them is you don't waffle. You don't give them every evidence to doubt that you're capable of doing this. So, for example, by lacking methodology, rigor, or any sort of things. So they come to the end of the project description and say, yeah, this is a fantastic project, and everything sounds good. And then they go to the rope section, and sort of you already have the benefit of the doubt. So now just don't lose it. So just say, okay, you know, I've done this, and give evidence for it. I've done this, evidence, and make sure that it's clear why you tell them this. So you tell them, okay, I've done this many publications, here's evidence for it. I'm in the top quarter in this discipline, here's evidence for it. And I've won that much grant, here's the evidence for it. So I am capable of leading a project, because they want to make sure you can lead a project. Okay, good, great. You can say, okay, here are all the workshops that, you know, I've taught statistics, here's all the workshops that I've done, evidence for each of those things, and say, okay, so I have the capability to do the statistical side of things. And then you go to the next one and say, okay, here's the teaching, here's the supervision that I've done, so I'm able to supervise the students that I'm going to hire on this project. So it's you know, it reads much more like a sort of factual Wikipedia article with references. It's just, you know, sentence after sentence where you provide evidence for the skills that you claim you have and that are necessary to successfully complete the project. There's no space for sort of like being very dramatic in your description, but there's also no space for saying things like, oh, you know, I shouldn't mention this award. It might, you know, sound a bit big mouthy. So just factually go through the things that are relevant. But if there's anything that you're proud of, but happen to not have tangible evidence for, it goes out of the window. Only say anything that you can, you know, factually prove immediately in the brackets or in the next sentence. I think that's probably the single most important thing for the rope section.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Look, we've got 2 minutes left. I'll ask each of you to give maybe your top tip in terms of people's preparing to apply for a DECRA. Anna, what's your top tip? Putting you on the spot here.
I wasn't ready for this question. Let me think. I think, yeah, start early. Yeah, that would be it. Start early. Give yourself 2 times to apply.
Yep, excellent. Helen, your top tip?
Mine would be find a mentor who's going to really guide you and be honest.
Yeah, great. And Steffen?
So it's a bit of a sad one, but what's your plan B?
That's a great tip. Don't put all your eggs in the DECRA basket.
It's like, you wouldn't be here if you wouldn't be, you know, excellent, talented individuals. But the reality is that with all these grants, there's a benchmark you have to get across in terms of, you know, being impressive and all these sort of things. And I'm sure everyone here can perfectly achieve this. Unfortunately, there's also a huge luck component. And since this is such a big career step and decision, make sure you've got a backup plan. So the moment you submit, assume it's rejected.
Yeah. Great.
That's a great way to end.
What a way to end. Thank you so much, Steffen, Anna, and Helen. It's been really great to have your wealth of wisdom and sharing that with everybody here today. And on behalf of AMPS, we really appreciate you giving up your time to talk to us about applying for a DECRA. So virtual round of applause for our panel members. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for organizing. I very appreciate the invitation.
No, it's just wonderful to have you all together to talk about this, because, you know, the chances of success are so low, but to have 3 people in music science is just amazing. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
See you at the next section, everyone.
Right.
Thank you for being an amazing host.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye.
Soon, I hope.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.